dreadful noise plebs make when they're happy.
Hello, everyone. Today, I'll be going over the first secession of the plebeians, an event you could say was the first major move of the lower classes to establish themselves more firmly in the political order of the Roman Republic. The first secession was part of the larger and much longer conflict of the orders, which took place over multiple centuries and many generations, from 500 BC to 287 BC. Now, the conflict of the orders covers many different social and political reforms that happened during those years in the Roman Republic, but the gist of it all is that the two major social classes in Rome, the wealthy aristocratic patrician families, who for generations had controlled the state and its wealth, as well as the lower class plebeian families, who were still full Roman citizens, but lacked the ancestry that the patrician families claimed they had, or did actually possess. These two groups weren't ever able to really come to conclusions or satisfactory ends on many issues that plagued the Romans and their Italian allies at the time. But in the beginning, it was much simpler, actually. Rome, since its founding, had continuously conquered and consolidated more and more territory, which led the Romans, well, more specifically the patrician Romans, become extremely wealthy. We're talking big bucks here, big sesterci. And as the territory of the Romans grew larger and larger, the wars of conquest they were fighting began to be further and further from Rome and its immediate surroundings, where all the soldiers lived. Now, unlike today, at this time, being a soldier was not a profession, and you didn't get paid to be one. In fact, it was just assumed that if you were a man who had a certain amount of wealth, that when the time arose, you would be a soldier. If you were able to afford a decent set of armor and weapons, and possibly if you were part of the wealthier class, maybe even a horse, you would enroll in the army when called for. And that was how Rome at this time fought their wars. With an army made up of citizen soldiers, who the bulk of consisted of farmers and men from the plebeian class, while the officers and higher ranks of the army were filled up with patrician nobles and their sons. These men would at first only spend the campaigning season from around early spring to late fall in the ranks of the army, traveling around to wherever they were needed, or wherever their commanders ordered them to go. And at the end of those months, they would be released from service, given whatever loot or booty that was promised to them, if they even got any at all. Then they would all head back to their various villages and towns, and ultimately their homes, to bring in the harvest and prepare themselves and their families and communities for the long, cold winter. But at this time in Rome, the people they were fighting and the lands they were fighting in were much farther away than they used to be. It's no longer just crossing over the Tiber River and going to raid some Sabine settlements, and maybe go rampaging through some Etruscan territory, and we'll all be back before the first snowfall. No, now the Romans were looking farther afield, and not just to do some raiding, but to conquer these lands and these peoples, and bring them under the influence of Roman power. And having your army go home every single winter isn't very conducive for doing that. Because all the people you just pushed out of the territory you took, well, they're not just going to go, well, darn, we lost last summer, so I guess our ancestral homeland is theirs now. No, they're just going to move right back in, and the men who escaped death or enslavement in the battles the year before will just come right back, and you'll have to fight them all over again, in the same land you fought them for last year. So, naturally, the Roman Senate and the consuls leading these armies began to keep their men in the field for longer and longer periods of time, eventually culminating in men being absent from their homes and their farms for years and years at a time. And over the decades of war and conquest by the Romans, the men who did the bulk of that hard work began to become poorer and poorer. After returning home from lands far away, they'd find that in their absence, their families and their farms had fallen into disrepair. Almost all came home to find a plot of land that was no longer prosperous, but in fact would cost way too much money to even try to get going again. With no cattle or seed or chickens, I mean, hell, not even a dog. The land hasn't been tilled and worked in years. The tools you used to use have fallen apart or become broken when your wife or young children try to use them. Or just straight up stolen from you. Actually, you'd be lucky if your wife was still there when you came back and hadn't been taken into the home of a wealthy aristocrat as a slave to pay for the debts the family had incurred when you were gone. So many of these men, without any other option really, sold their farms for much less than what their true value was and headed into the city. Some men came home to find their farms already taken over by a wealthy patrician family and had no way to even begin to try and take it back. And pretty much all of them had debts, which of course they were unable to pay back. Actually, at this time, usury was a major problem in Rome. The wealthy men of Rome would take advantage and prey on the already indebted and poor, or they would give out loans and then put something like 40% interest on it. And because the plebeians had nobody to tell and complain to, of the abuse that they were facing, that's just how it was. But things like this can only carry on for so long before even the lowest of the low rise up and say, enough is enough. And usually, all it takes is for the kids of the low to be affected. And you can bet that many of these men who had fought and sacrificed for Rome were beginning to see their own families go hungry and homeless. It was in the year 495 BC that after another Roman victory, this time over a coalition of Latins at the Battle of Lake Regillus, that word traveled into the city of Rome that the Volsci tribe, an Italian tribe of peoples inhabiting the south of Latium, where in marshy and hilly lands, they formed their own little state, and for several hundred years they were one of Rome's fiercest and most formidable foes, until in the 300s BC when their land and people were finally fully assimilated and into the growing power of the Roman Republic. Little side note here, while researching the Volsci, I learned that Augustus, like Octavian Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, he actually came from Volscian descent. So, I mean, it doesn't matter at all. I just thought it was cool. So, anyways, back on track here. In 495 BC, news made it to Rome that the Volsci were preparing for war, and actually, they had apparently allied themselves with the Latins for the year 496 BC, but were too slow getting their army together and missed the whole battle, and couldn't come to the aid of the Latins. But they thought, fuck it, we might as well try. We all got together for a fucking reason. Can't just turn around and go home. What about the loot? What about the booty? I came here for two kinds, and I'm not leaving without at least one. So back in Rome, the consul Publius Servilius Priscus Structus gathered together a force of men and marched into the Volscian territory, where immediately the Volsci surrendered and were so scared of the Romans that it said they gave up about 300 children from the leading families of the Volsci to be taken as hostages. But then, after that, apparently the leaders of the Volsci went to the Hernici, another Italian tribe, and allied themselves with them against Rome, and also tried to send ambassadors to the Latins. The Latins, though, having just been defeated by the Romans, were furious that the Volsci would even try and lure them into another fight against Rome, and they tattled like little bitches. They handed over the Volscian ambassadors to Rome, which we can only assume it didn't end well for those guys, and then told them all about the plan of the Volsci and the Hernici to come together and attack the Romans. Because of that, the Roman Senate was so thankful and happy, apparently, with the Latins, that they let go 6,000 Latin prisoners living under Roman rule, and allowed them to return to their homes and villages, and live amongst their own families and In return, apparently the Latins are said to have sent back a golden crown and donated that to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Now, this story, it doesn't make sense to me, because the Volsci, who missed the first battle and now would have less allies on their side, chose to continue to head towards Roman territory. But when confronted by a consul and his army, immediately gave up and were so scared that they gave up 300 of their kids as hostages, only to turn around and very shortly after giving up their kids, their future, basically, they apparently ally themselves with another tribe and want to fight Rome again, which makes zero sense at all. You already gave the enemy pretty much everything you hold dear, so there's nothing really to fight for, and if you try to fight all the Romans have to do is, well, they have your kids. So, good luck. In my head, I'm thinking that this story could possibly be made up, and that later on, after the fact, the Romans came up with this story of the Volsci as a justification as to why they conquered and enslaved these people that they had lived beside for generations. We didn't go into your lands and beat you because we wanted to. We had to because y'all just kept trying to come after us. So we just did the prudent thing and, we got rid of the problem altogether. Back on track now. It was sometime after this little foray into a Volscian territory, that the soldiers and citizens of Rome began to speak up a little bit about the difficulties they were all dealing with in the face of rising debts, and the fact that they were given severe punishments, like being beaten or imprisoned for not even being able to pay off, moneylenders. This time is where the famous account of Livy, of a former army officer who came to the forum one day with his clothes in tatters and his hair long and beard dirtied, with his body looking skinny and malnourished. Even though he looked terrible, many people recognized this man as a warrior, and they recalled all the deeds he had performed in battle, while he displayed the scars he had to prove it. He then told the people gathered around him of how he ended up like this. It was during the wars with the Sabines. The Sabines had destroyed his farm, burned down his home, and stolen everything he had, and that while this was happening, a tax was put on him that obviously he couldn't afford, so he had to borrow money. But due to usury on account of the moneylenders, over time he had been forced to give up his farm, his father's farm, then eventually his grandfather's farm, until he could pay no more. And that when the creditors arrested him and brought him to a private prison where they beat and tortured the man and threatened him with death if he didn't pay. And when he showed the now growing crowd the whip marks on his back, the crowd grew enraged. Men and women from all around the city who were in debt flocked to the mass of angry people, where they found the people willing to take them in, protect them against the abuses of the creditors. And in the forum, a large and unruly crowd began to mass. When this was made known, the two consuls of that year went to the forum. Again, Publius Servilius Prictus Structus and Appius Claudius Sabinus Regilensis, who, by the way, was the founder of the famous Claudii family, who from the earliest times of the Roman Republic till the end of the Western Empire were always a part of the upper classes and held important roles in the government throughout the Republic and the Empire. These two men found the forum packed with angry plebeians, demanding that the Senate be convened so that they could debate on and consider what to do about the massive amount of debt the plebeians had. But because so many senators refused to come to the Senate House out of fear of the mob, the plebeians began to think that the Senate wasn't going to convene or even do anything about their problems. To them, it was like they were completely being ignored. And it was only at the last moment, on the threats of real violence breaking out, that finally the senators came together in the Senate House. But even so, senators couldn't come up with any ideas on how to deal with this problem. Appius, Claudius, he wanted the authority to deal with the plebeians in a harsh way and to punish them, while Servilius said that, some concessions should be given to the people. Now, it couldn't have been better timing, or worse, I guess it depends on how you want to look at it. But a group of Latin horsemen showed up in Rome, announcing that a Volscian army had entered their lands and was raiding it, and they would really, really like it if the Romans would come and help them out. But of course, the Roman citizens refused to sign up for the army, so the Senate sent Servilius to the Forum, where he gathered the plebeians together, and at first he calmed them by giving decrees that would alleviate some of the more harsh burdens of debt, and that actually the Senate was already considering their plights and was meeting to come up with ways to reduce public pressure and concerns about the rising debt and inequality. It's just that they were interrupted by this news of this invasion, and they really need to deal with this before they can deal with your problems. He also announced an official edict claiming that no Roman citizen should be imprisoned for not enrolling to fight, and that anyone who does enroll, that as a soldier during his service, his property and goods were untouchable, and that his family was also untouchable and could not be arrested while they were away. After this edict was announced, the debtors who had been imprisoned by their creditors were released, and many of them enrolled in the army, and in doing so, caused a great many other men to follow their lead and enroll as well, and take the military oath. When these men were done, Servilius led the army out to face off against the Volsci. After leading the Roman army out of the city, Servilius tracked down the Volscian forces and erected a camp just a short distance away from them to spend the night. The Volsci, though, hearing of the troubles going on amongst the Roman soldiers of Rome, attacked the Roman camp at night in hopes that they could cause some desertions or possibly have some defectors come over to their side. But this daring night raid was repulsed by the Romans, who held strong throughout the night. Undeterred by their failure the night before, the Volsci launched an all-out attack on the ramparts of the Roman camp the next day, bringing earth up to the trenches and filling them in so that they could reach the walls. Servilius held his men back, actually allowing the attackers to destroy a portion of the ramparts and the walls, until he saw the moment that he was looking for and ordered his men to charge in an all-out attack. The Romans charged forward, and in that first clash the Volsci were defeated and pushed back out of the camp. The Romans didn't stop, though, pursuing the fleeing Volsci men all the way back to their own camp, where they surrounded, destroyed, and plundered it. And even then, the Romans weren't finished. They chased the last remaining survivors all the way to the town, a Latin town, of Susa Palmitia, where again they surrounded the town, took it, and then plundered that town of all its wealth as well. There were further military actions going on that happened against the Sabines and the Aurunci as well at this time, but those stories don't need to be told to continue this one. But if you'd like to hear about those, let me know. I plan on covering the Sertorian War after this, but I could start looking into those events a little bit if anybody's interested. Anyways, with their lust for loot and blood satiated, the Roman army returned home in glory, and in anticipation that the Senate was getting ready to listen to their demands and give in concessions and to make reforms to help the population out. But Appius Claudius had other ideas. When the army returned, he made several decrees repealing what Servilius had said, and the debtors who had previously been released from prison were arrested again. And also, even more people were imprisoned due to debt. It's said that one soldier tried to appeal to Servilius himself, and a crowd gathered around him with all the people reminding him of the promises he had made them, and that it was time for him to bring this matter to the Senate. But with the patricians all on the side of Appius, Servilius was really, honestly, put between a rock and a hard place, and in the end was able to do nothing for the people. This event earned him the distrust of both parties, with the Senate and patricians believing him to be a populist, and the people thinking that he had betrayed their trust. At the same time, Appius and Servilius were also trying to decide which of the two of them would dedicate a new temple to the god Mars after their victories in the battles against the Volsci. So the Senate actually decided to refer the choice to the people or to the popular assembly, and to spite the Senate and the consuls, the people gave the honor to a military officer from one of the legions named Marcus Latorius. And of course, this pissed off the Senate and Appius Claudius to no end, but they couldn't do anything about it. I mean, at this point, the people were pretty much at their breaking point with the patricians and the senators all together. It actually got so bad that if people saw a person who was in debt being led to the courts or taken away, immediately a mob would form around them to protect the debtor, and violence would break out against the creditors and their lictors. The people were so unrestrained at this time that they do this in front of the consuls, who, even with their power, were unable to stop the unruly crowds. When hostilities with the Sabines sparked up again, the Senate issued a decree that enrollment for the army was open. But, nobody signed up for that. This thoroughly incensed Appius, who blamed all of this on Servilius and his failure to punish the men who refused to sign up, and by not passing judgment on the debtors, and that he alone would restore the dignity of the consulship and of the Senate, and that he alone would uphold the Republic. He then had one of the ringleaders of the seditionists arrested by his lictors, but when they attempted to take him away, he sought to use his right to appeal to the people, and even though Appius wanted to stop that from happening, he was correctly and smartly held back by the other leading patricians, and warned that doing so would be a step way too far, and that the right to appeal to the people was a Roman citizen's birthright. And that is how the rest of Appius Claudius's and Servilius's terms as consuls would go, stuck at an impasse. And for the rest of 495 BC, that is where it remained. In the beginning of the year 494 BC, in March, the two new consuls were Aulus Virginius Tricostus Calliomontanus. My god, what a name! And Titus Veturius Geminus Cicerunus. I mean, Jesus. Just reading some of the names of the patrician men at this time really gives you a sense of how important they all thought they were. These two men had gotten word that for some time now, the plebeians had been having nightly meetings on the Aventine and Esquiline hills. So, like little bitches, they ran to the Senate and told on them. I've said the Senate about 1,000,000 times already in this video, but I never really explained it. Basically, the Senate is 100 or 300 guys. I can't remember which it was at this time, but about 100 or 300 guys from the richest families of Rome. They didn't really have to be there, but in a society, the upper classes usually don't just let the poor people decide on policy and shit. So they make a special little group of people that has to be pleased before anything could ever get done, and they will usually actively fight against change, even if that change would be for the betterment of society as a whole. It's why we will never see an empire last forever, and the Roman Senate was that special little group of people during the Republic that, if they weren't happy, nobody could be. Anyways, back on track here. When the Senate found out that the consuls had allowed, or were still allowing, these meetings to take place, they were downright outraged. Enraged? Outraged? Whichever one. I mean, so mad they didn't even vote on what to do about these meetings. They just scolded and put down the two consuls for allowing this, and made a decree that men should be enrolled as soon as possible so that they would be distracted from these protests and nightly meetings. So, Aulus and Titus made their way down to the forum and climbed the rostra, which was a public speaking platform in the forum, and started calling out the young men of the city by name. But, even so, none of them budged or made any type of move to join the consuls on the rostra and enroll. Instead of listening to their consuls, the people started to gather around the rostra and made the message clear that nobody was going to enroll until the people's rights and liberties were restored to them. Aulus and Titus could sense the tension in the air and knew that if they were to push these men too far, violence could erupt, and that they would be at the center of it. So instead, they left the forum and made their way back to the Senate House. Now, upon return to the Senate House, apparently many of the younger senators started to berate and belittle the two men for being big pussies and being scared of those dirty plebeians. But, in their defense, they told the senators that y'all don't understand. These fuckers are pissed. We can't just tell them what to do right now, or else there's going to be consequences. In fact, why don't you guys come down to the forum and see for yourself? Some senators, taking them up on this offer, returned to the forum and up onto the rostra, where they called out the name of a man who they knew to be one of the ringleaders, and they knew he wouldn't enroll. And of course, when they called his name, he just stood there, unmoving and unwilling to break, even in front of the consuls and these new senators. So, the senators sent their lictors after him. But the man was surrounded by his own supporters, and they held back the lictors, which in turn enraged the senators even more, to the point where they actually left the rostra and tried themselves physically to help the lictors detain the man until they too were pushed back by his friends and supporters. Now, this situation was headed for violence, and very quickly, until Titus and Aulus, the consuls, managed to step in and use their consular powers to get the two sides to step back from one another. After managing to assuage the crowd and the senators, Titus and Aulus called for the Senate to meet again, where the men who were just involved in the scuffle down in the forum wanted a criminal inquiry to take place. But with all the yelling and arguing and fighting amongst the senators, nothing came of that. The unruliness of the Senate got so bad that finally Titus and Aulus began to upbraid the senators for acting just as bad as the people in the forum were acting. And finally, 3 propositions were put forward to vote on. Appius, the consul from the previous year, stated that the reason why the people had been so rebellious and unfearing of any consequences is because the right to appeal to the assemblies, and that a dictator should be appointed, so that the people couldn't appeal to any assembly, and the dictator could just, order them all to enroll. Titus Larkius, another senator, proposed that, hey guys, maybe we should just do something to help out the plebs with their debt and stuff. Like, the whole reason why we're in this situation is because they're getting screwed by debts and shit. So let's just, chill out, maybe cancel some debts, allow others to work them off in a more manageable time. Let's help the people out here a little bit. I'll tell you right now, they did not go with this idea. And the third option that was proposed by a senator named Publius Virginius, that the debt relief and the help that Larkius proposed should be given, but only given to the men who had just recently served against the Sabines and the Runci. They didn't choose this one either. No, they went with Appius, of course, and appointed a dictator, Manius Valerius Maximus, who was the brother of the famous Publius Valerius Publicola, who was one of the leading aristocrats back in 509 BC, who helped to overthrow the monarchy and start the republic. It was actually he, Publicola, in his year as as consul, that instituted the right to appeal to a popular assembly, which earned him the nickname Friend of the People. Now, with the war looming on the horizons against three different opponents, the Sabines, the Aquii, and the Volsci, Manius had to do something quickly. So he announced a decree that was in effect the same decree that Servilius had given the last year, and again, the people fell for the ruse and signed up for the army. 10 full legions were raised, and the two consuls each took 3 legions, while Manius took 4 legions with him to deal with the Sabines. Virginius took his men and defeated the Volsci in battle, and then pursued them into their own lands, where he destroyed them and captured their land for Rome. The other consul, Veturius, took his men into Latin territory to deal with the raiding Aquii and pursued them. When they fled into the mountains, he wanted to wait them out, but his men, they really wanted to get back to Rome due to the ongoing political struggles there, and forced him to attack, which in the end worked out because the Aquii were terrified and abandoned their camp, allowing the Romans to win without a fight, and losing all of their loot and camp goods to the Romans as well. With all 3 threats dealt with, the armies returned to Rome, and their dictator Manius was determined to get the Senate to do something about the issues that the people were facing. So he went to the Senate and asked them to please address the concerns of the citizens. But again, the Senate refused to act, so Manius, angered and at his wits' end, verbally attacked the senators for their obstinance and unwillingness to help the people, or to capitulate at all. He then resigned from being dictator and went home, and it said that on his way, he was applauded by the people. Now the Senate, which was scared of even more seditious activities taking place, made a decree and ordered that all the legions were to march out of the city. But the people, enraged by this order, went so far as to contemplate capturing and killing the consuls so they could avoid their military oaths. But in the end, it was decided that even doing that wouldn't release them from their vows, because a criminal act could not absolve them of a holy oath that they'd taken. And this is when a plebeian named Lucius Sicinius Villetus proposed that they all leave the city of Rome and head to the Mons Sacer, or the Sacred Mountain, which was 3 miles from the city. So that's what the plebeians did. They gathered their things and themselves and their families, and they made their way to the Sacred Mountain, where when they arrived, they began to fortify the hill, set up a camp, and then they waited. The Senate, fearful of what the plebeians would do next, finally acquiesced and sent a former consul, Menenius Lenatus, to negotiate with the men on the Sacred Mount. But when Menenius got there, he began by telling the people gathered there about a story. This is where the story about the human body parts all being important to one another, and that if one part didn't do its job, the rest of the body suffered. But when all parts worked together, the body could keep itself strong and healthy. Of course, he was using this story as an allegory for the Republic, and it seemed to work on the plebeians, because when he was done, he asked the plebeians to send envoys with him back to the Senate to negotiate terms of reconciliation. The plebeians sent Marcus Decius, Spurius Iclius, and Lucius Junius Brutus, who I believe is the same Brutus who overthrew his uncle, but I can't verify that. I tried to check, but I couldn't really find out if that was true or not, so don't hold me to that. During the negotiations with the Senate, it was concluded that a new class of officials be invented, the tribunes, who were to be solely elected from the plebeian classes and be put in place to represent represent the interests and well-being of the common people against the wealthy patrician class. There were to be 5 tribunes, and all made sacrosanct, meaning they were protected by law and by the gods from physical harm from anyone, and harming them was punishable by death. And with that, the end of the first secession of the plebs came without bloodshed. Of course, Rome and its people still had many, many generations to go before the battles between the patrician and the plebeian classes were over. In fact, it never really ended. Even with the fall of the Roman Empire, we still have issues amongst the different classes of wealth in our societies today. So I guess it just goes to show that if there's a way to exploit people, somehow, some way, the upper classes will. And that if we all as a working class don't stay vigilant against the corruptions and abuses of power, we could find ourselves under the boot of a class of people who think very little of the less wealthy and lower classes. And again, even though this was the end of the first secession of the plebs, there was multiple more to come. In Livy's writings, he reports that there was a famine in the year 492 due to the fact that the plebeian farmers never sowed the crops during the secession. So the Senate was forced to order grain from Etruria, and that even more grain had to be imported from the island of Sicily the next year, which led to more unrest when the question of how that grain was to be distributed amongst the people, leading a man named Coriolanus to take drastic actions, be exiled from Rome, and in time lead his own rebellion at the head of an army of Rome's greatest enemies at the time. But that is a story for another day. The Roman patricians were just like the super wealthy that we have today. They used their money, power, and influence to steer the state of Rome in the direction that they wanted, and when they came up against any opposition, whether from within or without, they fought tooth and nail to the bitter end against any type of change or blow to their collective power over the state and the people in it. But sometimes the power of change and the momentum a movement picks up is too strong even for the people in power at the top, and they can do nothing but capitulate and get with the changing times, unless they want to watch their power and wealth slip away with the tides of change. Like in the times of the Gracchi brothers, who were murdered for their reforms, eventually only to have those same reforms passed by the same men who fought so hard against them. It seems to me that when it came to the point of losing it all in a rebellion or an uprising, the ruling class of Rome always managed to find a way to survive by giving just enough of what the people wanted to keep them satisfied for another generation or two. This is another reason why I think that the Romans managed to stick around for so long, because they were able to continuously allow more and more people a piece of the proverbial pie, and they had civil leaders who understood that things needed to change and progress for the people who you rule over, or else they'll eventually stop trying to work from within the confines of whatever social structure they're in, and instead look to tear it down altogether and start anew by their own rules. Thanks for listening, and have a good one.